Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to Environmental Social Justice. Today we have very special guests. We have Kim and Phil from the Blue Forest Conservation. And I would like to introduce them. They are doing amazing things with respect to forest fires, wildfires, and resiliency. So guys, please tell me everything about you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Wendy, for having us on today. And great to be on with you, Joy and Joel. So my name is Phil Saksa. I'm Chief Scientist and co-founder of Blue Forest Conservation. We're a nonprofit focused on using financial innovation to drive sustainable environmental solutions. One of the first environmental issues that we're focused on is addressing the catastrophic fire issue we're having here in the West. One of the reasons fires are so big this year and in 2020 is that we've been so good at putting out fires for so long that the forests have really grown up in the absence of fire. And we have so much more vegetation, more trees, more shrubs. And to a fire, that's more fuel. And that's one of the reasons we're having these huge fires more and more these days than we used to in the past. And so, you know, the problem is restoring the forests to their lower density, more historical conditions costs a lot of money. It's extremely expensive work. And the Forest Service alone has 63 million acres at risk of moderate to high severity fire in the West. If we think about the cost of restoring those acres at about $1,000 an acre, that's a $63 billion bill on our doorsteps. And the Forest Service alone can't bear the cost of doing that work. And so what we've worked on with our partners at the U.S. Forest Service and the World Resources Institute is to create the Forest Resilience Bond, which is simply a public-private partnership that allows private investors to fund the expensive upfront costs of this forest restoration work and enables all the groups that benefit to pay those investors back over time. And those groups include federal, state, and local governments, downstream water and hydroelectric utilities, and private companies focused on climate resiliency and who have infrastructure in these watersheds. And I'll kick it to Kim to talk a little bit about the benefits of this work.
Sure.
Yeah, thanks, Phil, and thanks, Wendy and Joel and Joy for having us today. So as Phil mentioned, one of the ways that we are approaching this huge issue of wildfire risk reduction and land management is by bringing together all of the different groups that benefit from a healthy forest. So if the Forest Service alone was to try to tackle this bill, it would take them at their current appropriation rates 130 years. But that's too late. The climate change issue is urgent. We know that every year the cost is increasing. So how can we increase the pool of money that can be used to pay back the investors to fund the upfront work? And so we look at it very holistically. One example is water agencies. So in the Western US, 65% of our water supply originates in forests. So a healthy forest means a healthy water supply, healthy drinking, healthy communities downstream. And so if their watershed burns, then that can mean that there's contaminants, there's sediment in your water. So the water agencies really have incentive to pay into the cost of this work. That's one of the things that we do at Blue Forest is we work with our local researchers as well as the World Resources Institute to actually calculate what is the cost of the work, what is the cost of the work of the side effects if there is a fire, and then use that to motivate groups to participate. And this includes water agencies. And the last thing I'll say is also, you know, fire affects all of us. It affects wildfire, it affects our air quality, it affects our infrastructure. So we just bring together all those groups.
So when you say forest restoration, like what exactly is that? Because I have no idea.
Yeah. And it's a variety of things, and it's different in every location, right? But it's usually a combination of ecological thinning, so taking the small trees that have grown up and yeah, raking too, yes. It's called another thing called mastication, where you basically grind all the small material down so it spreads the fuel out on the floor like mulch on your garden. And then prescribed burning, so getting healthy fire back into these forests where they can support it, and where that fire isn't going to blow up into something large. And so that's the way culturally that Native Americans took care of these forests, is there was a lot of burning very frequently, and with natural burning, that was what used to maintain these forests over time. With the absence of that, that's where we're having the problems that we're seeing today, in addition to the more extreme weather events that we're all getting. It's very windy these days, I would say.
Yeah, we're actually seeing, what was it, fire tornadoes we're now seeing?
Fire tornadoes that are caused by the fires. And I mean, you've seen the Palisades fire down there in the LA area already, and it's not even Memorial Day. And we've had the driest springs on record, and we're looking at another severe fire season, which burned over 4 million acres in California alone last year.
So we're just throwing money at the problem, right? Up in Sacramento, the governor has put a huge amount in this year's budget to battle the fires at like 3 or 4 times what the normal budget is for it. I know there are a couple of groups that have training programs, like anti-recidivism programs, to get fire workers out of prison, since we're going to be releasing 76,000 inmates due to the COVID budget relief. They're trying to put together programs such as those to be able to have the capacity to have people to get out there and fight the fire. But are we throwing money in the wrong things in order to just alleviate this year's fire season, as opposed to a long-term view, in your opinion?
Good question.
That is a good question, and that is what we're trying to look at. So how do we solve this from a systems perspective and not just throw money into what we think is most urgent today, right? How do we solve this for the long term? And part of it is workforce capacity. So allowing the those who have been trained in prisons to fight fires to then, once they get out of prison, still do that work. And in many cases, until recently, until the legislature changed the laws around that was unable to happen. So that's part of it, and getting that workforce capacity up and running both during fire season, but also not during fire season. So when prescribed burning can be done in the wetter months, when this restoration work needs to happen when there isn't a fire. So that is one of the issues. But if you think about it, here in California, they want to treat 1 million acres a year, 500,000 private, 500,000 public land, which would cost $1 billion every single year. And so Governor Brown had committed $1 billion. Current Governor Newsom is committing $1 billion, but it's going to be $1 billion every single year to get on top of this problem for the next 10 years. And they've signed a shared stewardship agreement with the Forest Service, where they've agreed to ramp up the amount of restoration they're doing by 2025 to meet that challenge. But you're right, it is, how do we get the total investment that is needed into this space? And that's where we want to bring in other entities that can help, not just the state, not just the federal government.
So real quick question. I've written a few papers on wildfires, and my background being insurance, always focus on that side. Frequency and severity are up. Insurance companies are having trouble offering coverages because it's not profitable anymore. So there are, these prescribed grazing, and people don't realize this is an ongoing situation. This is not something you do one and done. This will be continuous. But as you reduce the fuel load, and hopefully that will reduce severity and frequency, would that not reduce the cost of maintenance over time? It's a big project to begin with, but wouldn't it lessen over time and maybe not be as expensive?
Yeah, that's a great question and a great point. And that's another challenge that we're trying to overcome with the Forest Resilience Bond, is a lot of time the money exists to do the work, and then they say, okay, we did the work, goodbye. It's like, well, you have to maintain the forest over time. You have to continue with this work. So as part of the Forest Resilience Bond, we include that maintenance work. And by having the upfront investors provide the capital, we know that it will be there for every year for the length of the project, maybe 10 years, for example, instead of relying on appropriations every year. And all of a sudden, all your work could be negated. So there is the chance, I agree with what you're saying, that it could go down, but I think we're so far from that right now that would be a good problem, a good issue to have.
I'm thinking like 10 years down the road as things hopefully get better. And so going back to your financial collaborations that you have, is this anybody, or is this large corporations, charitable funds? I mean, who's primarily contributing to this bond?
Yeah, so I can take this one. So in our first forest resilience bond, we had 4 investors. 2 were foundations, and they make what's called program-related investments. And these foundations participated. It's part of their purview to invest in projects like this. And so these are below market rate investors. We also had 2 other investors, one of which was AAA Insurance of California, and then also a group called Calvert Impact Capital, which are impact investors. And so they got market rate. And so by blending these 2 different kinds of investors, we had an overall rate of return of 2.5%. So 1% for the below market rate, 2 foundations, 4% for the market rate investors, and then blended 2.5%.
Wow.
And for the groups paying those investors back, that included the Yuba Water Agency, who is a downstream utility that is a flood control agency, supplies water to agricultural irrigation districts, and is also a flood control agency. So they have a multi-purpose entity. And if a fire happens in their source watershed, they would be very much impacted in their operations in multiple ways. And so they saw the benefit of working with us to understand, okay, well, what is not just the environmental benefits, reducing fire risk and stabilizing carbon and water supply, but what is our real economic benefit here? So it's really about starting to make the business case to groups like utilities that ultimately it's going to be more expensive not to be involved in this than it is to be involved in this and being part of the solution up front. And so that was one of the groups. And then another of the groups includes some of the funding that you were talking about before, Joy, with CAL FIRE, California Climate Investment Program. And they're focused on forest restoration and using the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund revenue to address this problem from a climate perspective as well. So those 2 entities are paying those investors back over time.
Wow.
Now here, I'm kind of curious to know, so like the last fires that occurred, you had people getting displaced. And so then we start taking over new areas for them to build homes, as opposed to because it's not cost effective and there's no shelter and it's a whole thing, to put it mildly. How does that impact going forward? Because we're starting to take the forest for housing, but then the places that were burned are just sitting there how does that play out?
Yeah, a lot of those solutions come at the policy level. Where can we build? Where does it make sense? What are the regulations around housing that make it safe for these houses to exist in a wildland urban interface where you are right up against the forest, where you have measures that you can take, not just defensible space, but protecting your eaves and chimneys from embers coming in and landing and starting another fire? Because as you know, we're starting to see houses themselves are becoming the fuel for fire to start to run. And so preventing that is as important in many of these areas as restoring the forest. So it's a multi-sector problem and challenge, but this solution can work in any of these instances. We can work with defensible space around communities. We can work with fire breaks. We can work with improving our infrastructure around our communities to make them more safe during a fire. So yes, that's exactly right. And that's a little bit of the challenge of, okay, where does it just not make sense to build at all? Because we know this is going to burn. Like there's no question. And we know it's cheaper to build here and to put people here, but it ultimately isn't, right? Because these houses are going to burn down. And
then they just keep moving to the next location. And it's
So since this is such a large project with, how many forest lands and we have to protect and work on, are you guys doing this all internally by yourself? Are you partnering with other groups? Are you taking on third-party projects? I mean, it's a big ticket item.
Yeah, absolutely. So we work a lot with partners. So at Blue Forest, we're a 10-person nonprofit. We're very interdisciplinary. We have scientists and engineers, but we also have our CEO used to work on Wall Street. We have a forester. So, we bring a lot of different expertise to the table, but we're only 10 people. So we really rely on partners. We work with the Forest Service a lot. We work on, we often work on projects on their land with them very closely. We also work with the World Resources Institute. And so they really help us translate what are these environmental benefits for a water agency, for an electric utility, and how does that translate into a financial benefit or cost avoidance. We also work with different state agencies in California, Oregon, and Washington. Those are kind of our focus areas right now, but we also are looking broadly at the entire Western US.
That's fantastic. Fires, there's no more fire season. We've kind of all determined that. It's kind of a year-round thing now in the West. What's your priority now? Like, what are you guys focused on right now that you're aggressively going after, aggressively trying to address?
Sure, that's a great question. And I think what we're really interested in showing is that, one, this model works. And two, this model can scale to address the problem at the scale that required to address it. Small projects are not going to solve this issue. 1,000-acre, 10,000-acre projects of forest restoration, we really need to be thinking about hundreds and millions of acres, hundreds of thousands and millions of acres. And so with our first forest resilience bond in the Tahoe National Forest, the first project was a $4 million pilot to restore 15,000 acres, which is typically the scale at which the Forest Service plans projects. That was in 2018. Here, 3 years later, we're launching our second forest resilience bond in that same area that will cover more than 40,000 acres and protect communities and infrastructure in that watershed as the next step to getting to the entire 275,000 acre watershed that we're working in. So this is a process to really prove out the model, show how it can scale, and bring partners together to really fund the work that needs to be done.
Wow. So if someone were to, go ahead. Sorry, go.
So I guess my question was so say somebody, obviously this is a huge thing that you want to do. What's a way that like a normal person who's not a corporate or a huge investor can get involved? Like, I mean, whether it's just something in your own backyard or it's like what are some tips and tricks? Okay.
Great. Kim, you want to take it? Or you want me to?
Go ahead, Phil.
Okay. Yeah, there's a couple of ways to get involved. One is, we work very closely with forest collaboratives. These are the groups that decide, what is important for this forest, what is, high priority to be restored, what are the actions that are acceptable to take, what are the areas we want to protect in our local area. So encourage folks to get involved that way. We also work with individuals that are part of larger organizations. So if your organization is interested in being involved, then reaching out to us and understanding, what is the role that organization can play, whether it's a local partner, because, we're not the people on the ground deciding what makes sense to do and have those local relationships. So we work with a lot of those organizations to say, okay, what do you want to do? Because it's not us making those decisions. It really is the individuals and the organizations at the local level saying, this is what makes sense. And then ultimately, we do work with a couple of donor advised funds who are ways that smaller investors can get involved in this, and they aggregate some resources. We are not yet to the point where if you are an individual interested in investing in this work, that we can yet take your money and invest it. That is a goal that we have, and we'd like to incorporate that as part, because everyone is so interested in helping use their resources to drive this solution forward. And we want to be as open to that as possible, but we're not yet there to where we can have that be part of our model.
And it helps so many groups, right? It helps the homeowners, their insurance rates. It helps various people trying to find a technical skill during this time post-COVID, where most of the training is going to be technical. It's not going to be college educated, sitting behind a desk, pontificating problems. It's going to be people actually being able to get out and physically do the work for some of the challenges that are facing us here in the state of California. So it's a win-win for everybody. And it's also a win-win for a lot of these big hedge funds and investment firms that are trying to get involved with utilities and insurance companies, just to make things better for everybody. So it's a lofty goal with the amount of budget that we have statewide, but it takes companies like yours that are looking outside of the box that are actually going to make the solutions happen for us here in the state of California. So I really applaud you to Kim and Phil for it.
One thing I'm going to add
Joy.
to Joy's comment, though, because I love the fact that Joy said this is not something you can sit behind a desk and pontificate. This needs boots on the ground action. This needs someone going out there. Controlled burns are okay. I know people in the past fought that. One of the first papers I wrote on wildfire, I sat down with a local fire department, talked to the chief, and he said, we love controlled burns because that gets rid of the fuel load. So we do need to return to that. And then also getting industry involved. This is not a house by house situation. And many people in the insurance industry say, hey, we want to help, but then they only insure one house. This has to be community-wide. This has to be a community-wide approach, which is exactly what you guys are doing, which is utterly fantastic. And I think that what you're doing, you know, more power to you. I hope you guys grow to be gigantic and tons of helpers and tons. Get out in the field. I'll get out in the field. I'll put my boots on. I'm more than happy to help. I have done this in the past. I have fought fires once in Maine, but that's a totally different story.
Fantastic. And I think you bring up a good point that one of the things that we really focus on is rural communities and being able to keep jobs in rural places, these kind of jobs that are boots on the ground, you know, developing the restoration economy so that we can have, you know, a steady supply of wood products and we can develop that industry. We have the groups doing the restoration themselves. And by bringing in this financing solution, we can keep it local and enable these small businesses, these small contractors to do the work instead of having a big corporation who has the upfront capital themselves to do it. So that's a big focus of ours. And also the other thing that you were saying, Joy, about this is a win for the investors. There's currently a lack of investable projects. So going to investors is actually the last step in developing these projects because there's so many groups that want to invest in these kind of ESG, you know, good for the environment, socially beneficial projects. And there's a lack of projects. So we're really trying to make that up. Our first project was $4 million. Our second project will be, that Phil was mentioning, launching this summer, $26 million. So if we're able to scale, that's really one of our goals.
And if we can attract more institutional investment, like CalPERS and CalSTRS, who need investments of a certain size, right? They can't invest in a bespoke $4 million project, but they can invest in 25, 50, $100 million projects. And it's everyone who's working in California. It's their retirement funds that are helping drive this work forward. And that's something that I think we're seeing a lot of interest in. And so that's the kind of investors that we're really focused on. It's less the hedge funds and kind of the more risky investments, and it's more university endowments, pension funds, and those kinds of investors.
Wow. That's so impressive. I just love everything you guys are doing. And we'll close out with any recommendations for the family, for like a homeowner, that they can get involved, or how they find you. Let's do that. How they find you and how people can help. And, you know, large corporations, I think, could be fantastic investors because everyone's talking ESG nowadays. Very few people understand what it really means. So this would be actually a very good project to get involved with.
Thank you so much. Yes, you can reach out to us on our website at blueforest.org. And as you're thinking about getting involved in this, I think the very first step is contacting your local fire safe council, or if you don't have one, starting one, because that at the community level is the very first thing that is helping drive community protection and community connection to these risks and to forest restoration. So that would be the very first step I would do, and checking out the resources that the University of California Extension has for homeowners to understand what defensible space is, how do I maintain that, and what are the improvements to my house that I can make personally to help address this issue.
Fantastic. Kim, did you want to close out with any recommendations or suggestions?
No, I think Phil covered it, and just thinking about, you know, staying up to date, staying aware of the fire situation, trying if you go, everywhere from your house to if you go camping, just being aware all the time of the risks.
Absolutely, being cognizant. So Joy and Joel, I will let you have final words and then we'll be done for the day.
Well, thanks everybody. It was a great show, and I really look forward to seeing what you all do regarding the fire issue here in the state of California.
Thank you, Joy.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I think you guys are doing some awesome work, and as long as people stop doing certain things out in the woods, I think you would probably be in a lot better shape as well. But that's another,
That's another topic.
Understood.
We're working with what we can work with here. So thank you, everybody. This has been wonderful, extremely educational, and only we can stop the forest fires, right? So let's do this.
Great. Thanks, Wendy. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Nice to meet you.
Wonderful
Bye.
day.